A warning, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence. From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
I am in Chautauqua, so it's right on the sort of northwestern corner of New York State. It's sort of on the end of a large, very long frozen lake, and the whole place is covered in snow.
Times journalist Will Pavia has been at the usually quieter end of New York State.
In winter, it's almost completely empty. The houses all have these things on them that they call pajamas. They cover up their frontages so they don't get covered in snow. And there's like maybe one or two restaurants, but most people seem to eat either from the supermarket or the gas station. So it's a very small little upstate town.
Big news had landed in the local courthouse.
It's a beautiful courthouse, Yellowstone building, rather old and quite ornate. The first morning, I arrived along with a bunch of reporters from New York City, where we're quite used to turning up at the crack of dawn to try and get into these court cases, and the court officers were all rather confused. And what on earth were we doing standing outside in the minus 10 degree weather when the court didn't open for another hour? So it is rather a strange setting in a way for this case, which sort of has global implications in a sense.
Back in 2022, this county made dramatic headlines around the world.
The news that's come out of New York State just within the last hour about the novelist, the author Salman Rushdie.
The assailant had rushed on the stage where Rushdie was seated and then stabbed him multiple times.
As you can see from this video, it's very alarming. People in the audience rushing onto the stage to pull the assailant away and help Rushdie.
On stage at an arts festival, the British Indian novelist Sir Salman Rushdie was stabbed multiple times in the face, neck and torso. He was no stranger to threats. He'd been living in hiding for a decade after his 1988 novel The Satanic Verses was deemed blasphemous by some. A fatwa calling for his death was issued by Iran's supreme leader. But in recent years, he'd returned to a somewhat normal life, making appearances and championing free speech.
I think I have to be part of the fight. I mean, there is a fight about free expression, and I feel like I'm in that fight. I have a dog in that fight.
Last week, he faced his attacker, 27-year-old Hadi Matar, in court. Matar denies the charges of attempted murder and assault. So was Rushdie's attacker inspired by a decades-old death warrant? And what does Rushdie's story mean for the freedom of speech? The story today: what the Salman Rushdie trial means for free speech.
My name's Will Pavia. I'm the New York correspondent for The Times. On Tuesday morning, and it was the first thing the prosecutor said, he said, I call Salman Rushdie, the door's open, and in he comes. And he comes in quite slowly. He's 77 now. His wife is sitting right behind me, and she kind of almost gives a little sort of cry as he comes in, as if she's very struck emotionally by the moment, and she puts her hand to her mouth. I think just seeing him go in there for her must have been almost this dreaded event, I suppose. He comes in and he walks round the back of all the jurors and into this stand, which is right flush against the jury. So he's sitting almost right next to all the jurors who are all staring at him. And he's got on what are now his sort of trademark glasses. One frame is clear and the other is blacked out over his right eye. And he talks in this extremely calm, measured voice, this sort of gravelly British accent. There was a moment where he is talking about being attacked, and he's sort of talking about the injuries to his face, and he says he was stabbed most seriously in my eye. And he then removed his glasses and said, you can see what's left of it. There's no vision in the eye at all. His eyelids are sewn together, as he later told us, to cover it up. But it was just this incredibly striking moment, and all delivered very sort of matter-of-factly as well. And one of many moments, really, as he talked about what had happened to him.
We'll come back to Will a little bit later on. First, though, what of the life and times of Salman Rushdie?
I can't remember him not knowing about him.
Yeah.
Because you think he's been such a feature of the literary landscape, since 1981, when he won the Booker Prize for Midnight's Children.
Robbie Millen is Times and Sunday Times literary editor.
He's almost sort of larger than life. He's not just a novelist. I think he's he's also a symbol of free speech. But he's kind of one of those writers that had an outsized influence on many other writers.
For the uninitiated, who is he? Where is he from?
Indian-born, from a Muslim background. But he came to the UK as a child to go to rugby boarding school. So he had a kind of very English public school education. Then went to Cambridge. But his first career as a writer, wasn't writing novels. It was as an ad man. He was a copywriter for Ogilvy May, the kind of the aristocracy of advertising agencies, where he came up with the naughty but nice advertising line for cream cakes.
Fresh cream cakes, naughty.
But nice.
That'll do nicely for American Express.
American Express?
That should do nicely.
Already an outsized influence, and he's not even got started on the serious stuff. If you look at the numerous novels written by Salman Rushdie, a lot of them are really influenced by what we used to call the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. So those sort of tales from Persian, Arabic, Indian literature.
Quite fantastical,
allegorical, magical realism. So take his banger, Midnight's Children. On the very first page, there's an allusion to 1001 Nights.
And as someone who hasn't read Midnight's Children, I should admit, it is about what?
It's about everything to do with India, essentially. So it starts on midnight on August the 15th, 1947, which we know is the date of kind of Indian independence. And it's about a character called Salim, who's born exactly on the stroke of midnight and is imbued with magical powers.
And in terms of Midnight's Children, you can't really overstate how well received it was.
Yeah. So obviously it won the Booker, and then later on it won the Booker of Bookers. This was kind of a bunch of judges deciding what the best book novel ever had been. So he's won that twice, in 1993 and 2008. But there's a nice quote from Anita Desai, herself a kind of rather distinguished novelist, where she said that essentially there's a whole generation of Indian writers or people from the kind of Indian and Pakistani diaspora who were attempting to write Midnight's Children. So it's a really huge influence.
Tell us about the Satanic Verses. That was 1988.
It starts with two people falling from the sky. They've been on an aeroplane which has been hijacked by Sikh separatists. They land on a beach. One takes the form of the Archangel Gabriel, the other the devil. I mean, that's the kind of starting point. But again, because it's Rushdie, it's full of allusions and digressions and anything that takes his fancy.
And what was the controversy around it?
I mean, on one level, it's quite surprising it caused controversy because it's, like all of his novels, rich and elusive, full of wordplay and such like. So I don't think when it first came out, people noticed the controversial element. Certainly not sort of British book reviewers who perhaps not well versed in Islamic history. The controversial element was that supposedly the Satanic Verses of the titles, supposedly some verses that the Prophet Muhammad said, but then were sort of later expunged because the idea was that the devil had sort of almost tempted with an idea, put ideas into his head. So he ended up praising these kind of pre-Islamic gods. And then there was a sort of an element where there's a brothel where the women in it are sort of named after the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. The Ayatollah Khomeini, Supreme Leader of Iran, who issued a sort of fatwa saying it was a duty of Muslims all over the world to kill Rushdie.
1,000 Muslims gathered in Toronto on Sunday. Their call, ban the book, and justice for Rushdie.
Blasphemy is a capital crime in Islam, punishable by death.
But I think Rushdie's point, he said, this guy was old, dying. There's no chance he read this book that so offended him, nor his sort of acolytes. So sometimes I think we get sort of hung up, well, there must have been something in it which could cause such a furore. And you think, well, not necessarily, because I don't think his critics have usually made the effort of actually engaging with what he's written. But nonetheless, the fatwa was announced. It came on Valentine's Day, 1989. So Rushdie, in his joking way, calls it his unfunny Valentine, this fatwa. And in the UK, there were various demonstrations. The book itself was burnt in Bradford.
If somebody swear at ourselves, we will tolerate. If somebody swear at our parents, we will tolerate. But if somebody swear at our prophet and our big persons, we won't tolerate.
MPs like Keith Vaz, Labour MP, with a large Muslim population, started denouncing him. So it was a kind of very, very bleak time, actually. And there were sort of moments when you kind of thought that the literary world would rally round him. But again, there was big division. People like John le Carré, perhaps the most prominent, John Berger, another Booker winner, Germaine Greer, all big public figures, sort of thought he shouldn't have published the book.
So you have Salman Rushdie releasing this novel, very well received in some quarters, but obviously very badly in others, even amongst some, as I take your point, who might not have read it. The Ayatollah in Iran issues this fatwa, a sort of religious ruling, saying it's the duty of any Muslim to kill Salman Rushdie. How seriously was that taken?
Well, very seriously. I mean, people have lost their lives because of this, the fatwa, which apparently is irrevocable. Once a fatwa has been made, it can't be undone. A Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses were killed. The Italian translator was stabbed. There was sort of fire bombings in London. I remember sort of Dillon's bookshop in central London and Collett's, which was a kind of very small left-wing one, were both firebombed. The Turkish translator was a target of an arson attack, which 37 people died in that. Rushdie went into hiding almost immediately when he heard.
And when you say he went into hiding, to what extent?
Oh, a proper, this is internal exile in the country, constantly on the move. Moved 56 times in 6 months. But if you read his memoir, Joseph Anton, that was the name he took while in hiding, you can see him trying to make sense of his kind of strange captivity. So all of a sudden having to have close protection officers sort of living in his house at all times and trying to sort of find the space to write, which I think if you got 6 big guys lumbering around, he found quite difficult. So some people sort of almost saw it as a slight act of ingratitude, whereas I think he was just acknowledging the kind of, if you're a writer, you need to write, and if you can't write, your pen has been silenced. That's a failure for a writer.
And throughout that, is that where he really got that image as being, as you mentioned earlier, a sort of symbol of free speech?
Yeah, no, I think so. If you go back 10 years ago, do you remember the Charlie Hebdo attacks, 2015?
The satirical magazine in France.
Exactly, 12 people killed. The attackers thought that Prophet Muhammad had been disrespected. Penn wanted to give an award, which is a big organisation that campaigns for writers. I think it was Freedom of Expression Courage Award. But quite a few novelists try to distance themselves from Penn, sort of saying that we all believe in free speech, but, it's always that but. They didn't believe in sort of the mockery of religion. I think somehow they thought it was punching down because Charlie Hebdo, many of its staff members are white and France has a big Muslim whatever. It was a kind of a moment when you think, how can it be punching down when there's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world? So he got quite irate with these various luminaries sort of criticising Penn. And he tweeted, just 6 pussies, 6 authors in search of a bit of character, in relation to 6 authors who'd kind of criticised the award.
can dislike Charlie Hebdo. Not all their drawings were funny. You can dislike, but the fact that you dislike them has got nothing to do with their right to speak. The fact that you dislike them certainly doesn't in any way excuse their murder.
This free speech debate hasn't gone away.
You pointed out how the fatwa can't be revoked, but in I think the late 90s, 98, Iran said that they no longer supported his murder, and so he was able to return to somewhat normal life.
I think he sort of spent a lot of time testing the water, going to a party here, doing a talk here, sort of feeling his way out.
What is sad is that I'd actually got my life back, really. I mean, I've been living in New York City for 25 years. I was doing everything that writers do. Book tours, readings, lectures,
So he sort of popped up on strange things. Like, do you remember he appeared on Curb Your Enthusiasm? Made a joke about the best kind of sex, fat was sex, pick up women and such like. So he was always trying to be as playful as possible. But I think my colleague Satnam Sengera, when he interviewed in 2015, Satnam obviously wanted to ask about this really huge moment in the author's life. And he says, I don't want to talk about that shit. You have to let go of this. It's been 16 years. That's been perfectly okay. So I guess he thought he was safe. But clearly not.
Back to snowy, upstate New York and Will Pavia at a Chautauqua courthouse.
So obviously it's a big story, and as a correspondent, I wanted to cover it. But for me personally, when I was growing up, Rushdie was in hiding because of this fatwa. And I remember it seeming very serious, but also there would be these sort of jokes about it. I remember seeing a sketch, I think on Spitting Image, where a man in a frog suit emerged from a pond. And the joke was that this was Salman Rushdie hiding somewhere in Britain. And there was this strange undercurrent of feeling that somehow it was his fault, that he'd sort of brought it onto himself. And so I remember thinking of him as like a sort of almost controversial figure. And then I read Midnight's Children, and I really loved this, and I read some of his other books. And when I joined the Times and I was a diary correspondent, I went to a couple of parties where I met him. And he's a very nice guy and very easy to talk to. And I remember being struck by the fact that he was out and about now, that he was sort of living a normal life. I met him once in New York as well after I moved here, I think maybe in the 2010s sometime. And again, he's very easygoing, very sort of convivial sort of fellow. And so just a sort of fascinating individual. And so when this happened, it just seemed like the most extraordinary story.
So you've been there as exactly that happened in the courtroom, as he's had to face the man accused of stabbing him so horrifically. All of this happened on the 12th of August 2022, the attack. Take us through the actual nuts and bolts about what we know happened on that day.
So Chautauqua is a county, and then there's sort of a place within it called the Chautauqua Institution, which is like a sort of institution that runs a summer festival for the arts. Rushdie, on August the 12th, was due to speak to Henry Rees, who's the founder of a charity that provides refuges for exiled writers. So he was there to talk literally about making safe spaces for writers. So there's about 1,000 people in the audience. Another 1,000, a few more thousand apparently, were watching a live video of the event. He gets onto stage and they're sitting in chairs sort of at 45-degree angles to each other. They're sort of like slightly facing each other and facing the audience. And this is when a man clad in black with a black COVID face mask walks towards the stage. He drops a bag by the stage, according to the prosecution, and then he hurls himself up the steps and sprints across the stage and starts attacking Rushdie, who is still sitting down. And at first, Rushdie is so surprised that he doesn't know what's going on, and apparently doesn't, it takes him a moment to realize what's happening. It also takes people in the audience a moment. At first, some people say they thought that it was some sort of staged sort of event, to ram home the point about writers needing safe spaces. And then they realize what's going on. Reese, the person he's talking to, gets up to try to intervene. We also heard from a guy who was then the communications director of the Chautauqua Institution Festival, who's in the next room, and he sees this happening on the screen. He rushes out of the door and he charges across the stage and sort of shoulder charges into the guy with the knife, who's at this point on top of Rushdie, still sort of apparently attempting to stab him, and he sort of knocks him off. And then a bunch of other people pile onto the guy with the knife and hold him down. And meanwhile, there are doctors in the audience who rush to try to help Rushdie. They raise his legs in the air. Rushdie remembers somebody saying, "Get some scissors, we need to cut his clothes off to see where all his injuries are." They raise his legs so that the blood flows to his heart. When he was on the stand, he said, so I'm lying there on the stage with the blood spreading out from me. My clothes are being cut off and I've got my legs in the air. He sort of, something about almost the sort of humiliation of that was clearly something that he felt as well. And the fact that he survived was really thanks to the fact that he received this instant first-class trauma care.
What did Salman Rushdie have to say about that on the stand? What was his view on it?
Rushdie's account of it was this guy rushing across the stage towards him, and he doesn't see the knife, and he thinks he's being punched at first, and then he sees that there is blood pouring out of him, and he describes being stabbed in the eye, and he says, it was just incredibly painful. He raises his hand to try and protect himself, and the knife goes into that, and he still has lasting damage. He held up his hand for the jurors and showed them the scar. At some point, he sort of gave the jurors almost like a guided tour to all of the scars that he was left with. So he started at the top of his head and moved down. He said, "You can see here, the side of my mouth, there's a scar here." He said, "You can see that I still struggle to speak properly, even though his diction sounded very clear." He said he still has to make a real effort to form words properly. And he then sort of directed them to scars on his neck and showed them where there were scars on his chest and his abdomen. So all of that was incredibly striking. And of course, he's 20 feet from this man who's accused of doing all this to him.
Well, as you say, sort of amazing that there was somebody who could wrestle a knifeman off him, and then also people who knew what to do with somebody who was seemingly losing so much blood. What do we know about Hadi Matar, that the man accused? Has there been much information released about him?
So Matar is a sort of slight figure. He's 27. He comes into court every day wearing a sort of long blue shirt and dark trousers. And every time he comes into court, he says, "Free Palestine," or actually on Tuesday, he said, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." It feels like he's not averse to the limelight in a sense, but on the other hand, he's keeping his head down. When Rushdie arrived in court to testify, Rushdie at least once looked across the courtroom at this guy, and Matar sort of kept his head down and seemed to be looking at a notepad and didn't really look up at all, as far as I could tell. I have to say, he's still a little bit of a black box, but he grew up in New Jersey, fairly sort of secular upbringing by all accounts. His parents are from Lebanon, but they moved to America, so he grew up in the United States. They divorced in 2004. His father is from a village that's on the southern border of Lebanon, the border with Israel. And it's been a site of fighting during Israel's war against Hamas in over the last sort of year or so. It's been sort of targeted as a possible stronghold for Hezbollah. So he goes there in 2018. His mother said that he came back after a month and he seemed a changed person. He stayed in his basement room and he no longer spoke to his mother, except once he told her off for not raising him more and raising him better as a Muslim. After he was arrested, he gave an interview to a reporter at the New York Post from jail, in which he said that he admired the Ayatollah Khomeini, who issued the fatwa, and he said that he didn't like Rushdie and he thought that he was disingenuous. He hadn't read the Satanic Verses. I think he'd read like a couple of pages of it, he said, and he'd watched some lectures on YouTube. He had seen that Rushdie was going to be speaking at this event in Chautauqua. It's interesting because in the case, the prosecutor has said he's not going to talk about the fatwa or about any of that sort of history. He doesn't think there's any need to, because so many people witnessed the attack. There's video footage of it. So all these people saw this man with a knife run across the stage and stab an old man repeatedly. They don't need to prove that he intended to kill him. He clearly did intend to kill him, is sort of their case. We're not really getting into any of this sort of underlying assumptions about what Hadi Matar's motive might have been. He has since been charged with federal charges, and the federal charges are that he was seeking to support Hezbollah, that he was seeking to support a foreign terrorist organisation.
So what is his defence then? If there is all of this evidence, as you say, there were lots of people in the room, there's a live stream of it, so there's plenty of video. On what basis is he pleading not guilty, do we know?
This is a good question. So he was offered a plea deal and he said no. And on the first day of the trial, Lynn Schaefer, his lead attorney, got up and said that the fact that he had bought a ticket to the institution showed that he wanted to come and listen to a lecture. She said, he didn't sneak in, he didn't attempt to swim from the lake or come in by boat. You can see the jury sort of looking at this, sort of like slightly wondering what her point was. Rushdie, in his book, Knife, sees what happened to him, this being told that there's a sort of death order. He sees it as like the first of a much larger trend that culminates in his mind in the attacks of September the 11th. Seeing the strength that it must have taken for him to go and sort of testify in court, he does come out of it looking, like this sort of, I guess, this great defender of free speech who sort of stands up for secular values and also the right to sort of write about and talk about anything.
As we were discussing earlier, Robbie, he was already an enormous free speech icon and this figure that loomed over the literary world and our cultural world.
Yeah.
But now even more so, surely.
He certainly doesn't believe someone would write, or Rushdie does not believe someone would write an equivalent of Satanic Verses today. Certainly not in the Anglophone world, because no one has.
Yeah.
Publishers become very nervous. But I think in North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, there have been writers. One of them's just been arrested, Algerian writer, Bolim Sansal. He's sort of charged with generic kind of national security-related offences because he wrote a novel called 2084, a direct reference to 1984, Orwell's great novel about totalitarianism, but his is set in an Islamic totalitarian world. So he sort of writes in French, and then if you go further south to Senegal, there's a very good writer called Mohamed Mbougassar who wrote a very good book called Brotherhood, imagining a sort of Islamic State kind of organisation taking over a town. So there are brave voices out there, but it is interesting that they're sort of in the Francophone world. Whilst I think Penguin, who published him in the UK, were very brave in doing so, and they held the line despite great pressures. I'm not sure now, would they be so brave? I mean, it just takes a Twitter storm for publishers to lose their nerve now. And I think if you were sort of a young upcoming writer who wanted to say some kind of provocative things about specifically Islam, I can't see it happening.
Robbie Millen, literary editor at The Times and Sunday Times, and before him, Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times. You can find all of their work at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. The producer today was Sam Shantarasak, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition was by Maula Seto. The story at thetimes.com is how you can get in touch with us on any of the issues discussed in today's edition, or if maybe you've got a suggestion of something that we should be covering. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.